The secret life advantage only solitary men unlock. What if the greatest advantage in life, the one that unlocks your full potential, your deepest clarity, and your truest power, is something no one talks about? What if it's not money, not status, not even intelligence, but solitude? And what if most men will never discover this because they're too afraid to be alone? We live in a world that bombards us with noise, constant connection, endless content, infinite distractions. We're encouraged to be social, to network, to put ourselves out there. The man who enjoys solitude is often misunderstood, seen as antisocial, weird, or even broken. But what if that man has access to something sacred? Something the rest of the world forgot? Because here's the truth: solitude is not the absence of life, it's the amplifier of it. It's not loneliness, it's not isolation, it's a crucible. A place where the soul is tested, where the ego is stripped away, where the noise of the world fades and you meet the raw version of yourself. And that meeting, that confrontation with your unfiltered self, that's where the hidden advantage lies. I've watched this happen in real time. Men who pulled away from the crowd not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Maybe they were misunderstood. Maybe they were betrayed. Maybe they just woke up one day and realized the world was too loud to think. So they stepped back. They chose the hard road. And what they found wasn't emptiness, it was power. Power that comes from knowing yourself so intimately that no one else's opinion can touch you. Power that comes from not needing to perform, to please, or to parade.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
And yet, so few of us go there. Why? Because being alone forces us to see who we really are. It removes the masks. It confronts us with our fears, our regrets, our untamed desires. It's easier to scroll, to text, to party, to drown in digital noise. But if you want to become someone extraordinary, you have to step into the silence. Because in that silence, that's where the voice of your destiny is hiding. Let me ask you this: when was the last time you sat with yourself, with no distractions, and asked, who am I really? What do I want? What am I afraid of? Not what the world told you to want, not what your friends admire. What you want at the deepest level of being, most people never ask. And because of that, they never know. They just inherit desires like hand-me-down clothes and wonder why nothing fits. But the solitary man, he learns to tailor his own life. He builds it from the inside out. He doesn't chase, he attracts. Why? Because people can feel when you've done the inner work. There's a gravity to a man who's faced his own demons and didn't flinch. There's a presence to a man who's not terrified of silence. He becomes rare, and in a world of noise, rarity is magnetic. You see, solitude isn't about running away. It's about returning to something ancient, something primal. We've forgotten that some of the greatest minds in history were shaped in solitude. Marcus Aurelius, writing his meditations to himself. Nietzsche, walking alone in the Alps, questioning the foundations of morality. Even Jesus, retreating into the wilderness before stepping into his mission. Solitude has always been the training ground of the soul. It's where clarity is born. It's where purpose sharpens. It's where men stop reacting and start becoming. But here's the twist: solitude doesn't just reveal your strength. It also reveals your weakness. It shows you where you're a coward, where you've lied to yourself, where you've avoided responsibility. It's brutal. But that brutality, it's sacred because it's honest. And in a world full of masks, honesty is revolutionary. Let's be clear, solitude is not about being a hermit forever. It's about preparation. It's about building the kind of internal fortress that can't be shaken by outside circumstances. When you've spent enough time alone, you stop needing validation. You stop chasing applause. You stop fearing rejection. And from that place of wholeness, you re-enter the world not as a desperate man, but as a grounded one. So I'll ask you again, why are you so afraid to be alone? What is it you're running from when you fill every silence with sound, every quiet moment with distraction, every night with noise? Could it be that the man you're becoming, the man you're meant to be, is waiting for you in that silence? Because here's the secret no one tells you. The man who can master solitude can master anything. His thoughts, his emotions, his focus, his direction, and eventually his destiny. The inner forge, how silence shapes power, purpose, and perception if you stay in solitude long enough, not as an escape, but as a confrontation. You begin to notice something strange happening inside you. At first, it's disorienting. The silence feels loud. Your mind races. You reach instinctively for your phone, music, noise, anything to fill the void. But if you resist that urge, if you sit still just a little longer than your impulses want you to, something shifts. The chaos starts to settle. The noise within begins to quiet. And beneath all that static, you start to hear something else, your truth. This is where the transformation begins. In solitude, a man discovers not just who he is, but who he is not. He sheds the roles he was performing without realizing it. The expectations he carried, the identities he borrowed, the ambitions he inherited from others, they begin to fall away. What's left? A raw, unpolished self. And that's when the work begins. Because solitude is not passive. It's not about sitting in a cabin waiting for enlightenment to strike. It's active. It's a forge. It's a mental gym, a spiritual battlefield, a psychological mirror that never lies. And what you build in that forge is not just clarity, it's power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. And the power to delay gratification. The power to say no to your impulses. The power to choose principle over pleasure. That kind of power doesn't come from books, mentors, or motivational speeches. It comes from doing the hard, boring, uncomfortable work of being alone with your own mind and not turning away. When you master that internal environment, you become unshakable. Because if you can sit with your own chaos and not flinch, what external chaos could possibly break you? But there's another layer to this. Solitude also sharpens perception. When you're alone, you start seeing the world differently. You notice things others miss. You observe human behavior with a new lens. You become hyper-attuned to energy, to intention, to truth versus performance. You start asking deeper questions. Why do people say what they say? What are they avoiding? What are they projecting? Where am I doing the same? Solitude gives you the space to zoom out and see the patterns not just in others, but in yourself. You begin recognizing cycles, emotional triggers, unconscious habits, inherited beliefs. And once you see them, you can change them. And that's when purpose starts to emerge. Because when you strip away the noise, the distractions, the false goals, you're left with a clean slate. And from that slate, something new begins to form. A vision, a mission, a calling. not one assigned by culture or comparison, but one that arises from within. You start to feel it, a gravitational pull towards something meaningful, something real. And you realize, this is what I was missing the whole time. Not more followers, not more attention, not more pleasure, but direction. Let me put it plainly, a man without solitude is a man without vision. Because vision requires depth, and depth requires silence. If your mind is constantly hijacked by stimulation, you never get deep enough to access the part of you that holds the blueprint. And the blueprint for your life, the one no one else can give you. The one you were born with but buried under years of noise. So ask yourself, when was the last time you disconnected completely, not just from people, but from performance? When did you last take a day, a week, a month to be alone, not to escape, but to listen? What would happen if you did? What would you hear? What would you have to face? What would you finally understand? Because here's the truth, the man who avoids solitude avoids himself. And the man who avoids himself can never lead, never build, never truly love, not because he's incapable, but because he's disconnected from his own source, from the well of power within him that only silence can unlock. The inner forge is open to anyone, but only the brave enter, only the ones willing to be uncomfortable, to be honest, to be still. But those who step in and stay long enough, they come out with something priceless, self-command. And with self-command comes freedom. And with freedom comes purpose. And when a man moves with purpose, aligned with who he truly is, the world cannot ignore him. The weapon of detachment, why solitary men control what others chase. Once you've spent enough time in solitude, something subtle but profound begins to happen. You stop needing. You stop needing validation. You stop needing approval. You stop needing constant company, entertainment, or even comfort. You begin to operate from an entirely different center of gravity. And that shift is what gives solitary men their most powerful advantage, detachment. Your coldness, not apathy, but the rare ability to want without needing, to engage without clinging, to walk away without fear. In a world addicted to attention, possession, and control, this kind of detachment is not weakness, it's a weapon. Let's be real. Most people are chronically attached to people, to outcomes, to identities. They grip tightly to relationships that drain them, jobs that shrink them, habits that numb them. But why? Because they're terrified of the void, of not knowing what comes next, of letting go. So they stay stuck. They rationalize, they shrink to fit. But the man who's lived in solitude, who's confronted the void and realized it didn't kill him, he's not afraid to release. Because he knows detachment is not about giving up. It's about giving space. Space for truth to rise. Space for clarity to emerge. Space for something better to arrive. And this detachment gives him an unfair advantage in every area of life. In relationships, he's not desperate. He doesn't chase. He doesn't contort himself to please. Instead, he observes. He evaluates. He knows his worth because he's met himself in the silence. And because he doesn't need connection, he chooses it more wisely. He becomes magnetic not because he's trying to be, but because he's centered. And people are drawn to center. They can feel when someone isn't performing. They can feel when someone is grounded in their own presence, not floating in insecurity. In work, detachment means he's not enslaved by titles or trapped by external measures of success. He's driven, yes, ambitious, absolutely. But he's not defined by outcomes. He plays the long game. He's willing to lose short-term comfort for long-term greatness. He doesn't crumble when things fall apart because he's already experienced collapse in solitude. He's already built resilience in the quiet. So while others panic, he recalibrates. While others chase, he chooses. While others react, he responds with precision and power. Even in failure, detachment is a shield, because when your identity isn't tied to your results, you're free to take risks. You're free to experiment, to stretch, to evolve. The solitary man understands that failure isn't fatal, it's feedback. And because he's not performing for anyone, he's not humiliated when he falls. He simply learns, adjusts, and continues. This is the essence of true power, the ability to stay grounded no matter what life throws at you. But let's be clear, detachment isn't about becoming numb. It doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you feel deeply, but you're not ruled by those feelings. It means you can love without possession. You can pursue without obsession. You can dream without delusion. It's the ability to hold life with open hands, to give your best effort, your full presence, your whole heart, and then let go of what you can't control. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What are you clinging to right now, not because it's good for you, but because you're afraid of what life would be without it? A relationship? A job? A persona? What would happen if you loosened your grip? What would rise in its place? Solitary men ask themselves these questions regularly. Not because they enjoy pain, but because they've learned that letting go is often the only way to rise. And here's the paradox: the less you need, the more you attract. The less you chase, the more you magnetize. The less you cling, the more space you create for life to give you something real. That's why solitary men seem to have an edge. Not because they're smarter, not because they're luckier, but because they've trained themselves in the art of letting go. They've stepped out of the psychological prison of compulsive attachment. And in that space, they gain control over what others spend their entire lives trying to possess. Detachment is freedom. Detachment is focus. Detachment is clarity. And it's only forged through solitude. Because only when you've sat in silence can you hear the inner voice that whispers, you already are what you've been chasing. The hidden crown, why solitary men become kings in a world of servants after solitude, has refined your clarity, and detachment has sharpened your power. A final transformation begins to unfold, one that's invisible to the world, but unmistakable to those who've walked the path. It's the quiet coronation of a man who no longer needs to dominate, impress, or be seen. He doesn't wear a crown made of gold. He wears one made of sovereignty, and that crown is not given. It's earned through silence, through suffering, through choosing the lonely road when the comfortable one called the loudest. This is the secret life advantage only solitary men unlock. They become kings in a world of servants. Look around. Most people are servants not to others, but to their own impulses. They serve their craving for attention, for distraction, for comfort. They obey every emotional twitch. They conform to the algorithm of popularity, chasing what trends instead of what's true. But the solitary man, he's not reactive. He's responsive. He doesn't move because others do. He moves because he chooses to. And that, right there, is royalty. Authority over the self. In a world where everyone is ruled by their environment, their emotions, or their egos. The man who governs himself becomes rare, and rarity is value. This is why the solitary man doesn't need to prove anything. He doesn't need to show off his muscles, his bank account, his lifestyle. But he's not performing, he's living. And because his actions are rooted in stillness, they carry weight. People feel it. They respect it, even if they don't understand it. You walk into a room differently when you've built yourself in silence. You're not trying to dominate, but you do. Not by force, but by presence. And presence can't be faked. It only comes from depth, and depth only comes from solitude. But here's the deeper truth. The solitary man doesn't seek power for its own sake. He seeks alignment, and from that alignment, power flows naturally. He doesn't act out of ego, he acts out of purpose. He doesn't control others, he controls his direction. And because he's not distracted by the noise of the world, he sees further. He moves with vision. He thinks in decades, not days. And that long game mentality makes him unstoppable. But let me ask you something. Are you living like a king or like a servant? A king builds. A servant consumes. A king chooses. A servant reacts. A king holds. A servant grasps. A king serves a higher purpose. A servant serves his lower desires. And here's the twist: becoming a king doesn't start with conquering the world. It starts with conquering yourself. That's why solitude matters, because it gives you the space to see what's ruling you and the strength to overthrow it. There's a reason why the heroes in myths and legends always begin with exile, with wilderness, with isolation. Moses, alone in the desert. Buddha, under the Bodhi tree. Batman, training in the shadows. The hero's journey always requires solitude, because that's where the transformation happens. That's where the boy dies and the man is born. That's where the ego is dismantled and the soul is revealed. And once you've been through that journey, you come back to the world not as a follower, not as a faker, but as a force. You have nothing to prove, nothing to chase, nothing to fear. You become the calm in the storm, the mountain in the chaos, the man who knows who he is, where he's going, and what he stands for. So here's the final truth. The world will try to convince you that solitude is weakness, that you're missing out, that you're behind. But those who know solitude is the soil where kings are grown. And once you've unlocked its power, you no longer beg for the throne, because you realize you've been building it all along. That's the secret life advantage, and it's not for everyone. But if you felt the call, you already know. Welcome to the silence. Welcome to the forge. Welcome to the crown.